crucial, to Andrus Family Fund and Family Philanthropy Program. That's very long, so we're going to keep it at the Andrus Family Fund.
I am Allison Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Communities for Justice Schools Fund. So we are a donor collaborative, which means that we have a membership of funders who provide grant dollars to us to then re-grant to community organizers all over the country who are working for equity in their schools. So they are pushing on school systems, they are pushing on government, they are really making sure that codes of conduct reflect a value system that is an equity-based value system for young people, to ensure that young people are engaged in school, that they are allowed to remain in school rather than being suspended and expelled, which happens disproportionately for Black and brown children, and also school-based arrests and law enforcement referrals that happen in school, also disproportionately for Black and brown children. So they're really trying to make sure that the education system is equitable and healthy for young people.
And at AFF, we fund organizations that are particularly interested in working with young people between the ages of 16 and 24. And that was intentional. We chose that age group because it's oftentimes the age group where lots of funders don't focus on. But it's also in terms of service and policy and organizing, it's an age group that sometimes gets left out of the mix, for lack of a better word. And so we fund direct service organizations that are working specifically with young people that have been impacted by what we call disruptive systems, the juvenile justice system, the foster care system, the homelessness system, and then the school system, right, mm-hmm. which can be very disruptive for young people of color, and Black and brown, and gender nonconforming young people. We fund policy work, or especially around juvenile justice reform, and that some of that is political opportunity, right, because it's a very important political time right now for juvenile justice reform. And then we fund organizing groups. So some of the groups that we fund, we both have mm-hmm. as partners in this work, because we think that in order to be able to create an ecosystem of change, we have to fund the service, right? Like we have to fund what's happening now. We have to fund the political and policy and advocacy work. And then we also believe that the community organizing groups are what keep us honest mm-hmm. and what keeps our ear to the ground.
We had just met mm-hmm. and decided to come together for dinner and drinks mm-hmm. and, kind of toasted to the possibility of a conference mm-hmm. where we could really bring together the education justice grantee partners and juvenile justice grantee partners mm-hmm. that are part of our portfolio to talk about shared strategy, shared vision, because the population of young people that are impacted by both schools and juvenile justice are the same. And so we really wanted to be able to say, well, how can we build policy? How can we talk about organizing strategy and advocacy within those two worlds together?
Yeah. And, it's an interesting thing, because even though the populations that folks advocate for are the same, they oftentimes are not in the same room. I think something you said yesterday, Allison, that in the education justice space, oftentimes folks are very grassroots organizations mm-hmm. doing work on the ground. And in the juvenile justice advocacy world, sometimes it's grassroots folks that are mm-hmm. on the ground, oftentimes. And yet there's also this very policy oriented, or those policy organizations, and those folks oftentimes are not in the same room. And so mm-hmm. this was an opportunity. Well, how do you bring some of the policy folks and to sit at the same table, literally, with folks that are on the ground doing work that sometimes don't have access to mm-hmm. some of the work that the policy folks do, and the policy folks sometimes don't have access to the lived experience. Mm-hmm. And so it was an opportunity for us to say, oh, wow, well, we know all these folks, can we bring them together? And after lots of phone calls and a few drinks, here we are.
I think that this is a first of its kind in that we are really bringing also kind of the technology piece and the solutions piece. So, to the hackathon, the Justice Design Hackathon, for young people, youth leaders to be able to really truly create the solutions to the issues that we are talking about and that have been talked about, that is a first. And I think that kind of overlay for the 3 days together really means that we want this to be iterative. This is not kind of a one and done, but we really want to help mobilize conversation and to build the momentum that's happening in the movement space right now. And so I think for folks to be able to leave with new connections, new friends, new ideas, even the possibility of these new solutions, right? The hacks, the apps that the young people are building, that to me feels like a win. And then for us to think about how we can be supportive in new and different ways as philanthropy of the great leaders that are in this room right now and in this conference together, I think also will be a victory.
So I agree with everything that Allison said, and one other thing that I think for me is really important is that there are other ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there is another way of doing this work, both for folks on the ground, but also for philanthropy, right? Philanthropy can be very insular, sometimes doesn't talk to the folks that they're funding, and I think that it's important to be able to say, we are successful in philanthropic institutions when our partners are successful on the ground or in policy. And then also to think about how do we fund in ways that are responsive to communities? And so to the point, I was having a conversation yesterday with Jenny Arwade from RISE and Voice, I'm sorry. And part of what I was saying to her is, sometimes funders come in and we fund the research or we fund a certain portion of the work, and then we forget about the implementation and the accountability component. And so then how do we begin to understand that the folks that are working on the ground are doing the research, are doing the work, and then need to have help also to hold the powers that be accountable? And so I think hopefully this is an opportunity for us to begin to have that conversation, in part because it's responsive, right? Because it's what folks are telling us that they need. So I think to me that's another takeaway. There's a lot of funders in the room, and that we can all sit at the same tables, right? That the meetings don't have to just be funders here, youth organizers there, policy folks there. I think that that's actually rare. It doesn't happen that often.
I think there is progress in just public conversation. So, we talked a little bit about Occupy Wall Street yesterday, which really, I think, catalyzed what we saw happen with and around Bernie Sanders. It has really dovetailed with the movement for Black Lives. And so just kind of the groundswell that we're seeing right now, and people in different spaces talking about race and talking about racial equity and really wanting to understand and asking critical questions. Some difficult conversation that's happening in spaces all over and that is happening here right now, which is necessary, and that I think Eric Holder, I remember when he first took office, said, we are a nation of cowards when it comes to talking about race. We don't do that. And that is happening right now is really, I think, progress. And so I think for philanthropy to figure out how it can begin to measure that success and begin to think about what are the ways in which we can help to not only encourage dialogue and foster conversation, but build relationships, make sure that, strange bedfellows are having conversation and building together and getting to know each other in ways that are meaningful. That to me would be even greater progress. And I think for the folks in this room, they've seen great policy wins. So there have been, for our grantee partners, shifts in codes of conduct at the school level, at the school district level. There have been shifts in the ways in which superintendents and educators are talking about school discipline as a means of last resort for trying to correct behavior and really coming up with alternatives to keep young people in school, keep them engaged, and make sure that they are aware of implicit biases and explicit biases that occur in the classroom so that we can move past those and really build supports for the nurturing of the next generation of leaders that we need.
Yeah, I think there have been changes and definitely wins in the conversation around mass incarceration, right? I mean, I think, when you think like 10 years ago, would decarceration was it a word that people used, or the idea that there's sort of the fringe folks, right, talking about the prison industrial complex, and I think that there's incredible importance in being able to talk about, what are we doing?
Dr. Jessica Phillips Silver, who's a neuroscientist at Georgetown and has studied the brain and the child and adolescent brain, really provided a set of conversation possibilities for advocates when they are confronted with this notion of toxic stress is having negative impacts on low-income Black and brown brains in such a way that really kind of brings back conversations of eugenics, which James Bell referenced Friday on the first day. That narrative is growing about toxic stress and trauma and the impacts of those things on the brains of young people. And it's a dangerous narrative because it allows for the continued belief and the perpetuation of the belief that there is this racial hierarchy, that Black and brown people just are not as capable or superior in their own right. And so, that in that session, she really talked about how, brains are unique. They're like fingerprints. And so there is not a good or bad. There is not a hierarchy of brains. You can't look at a group of brains from Black and brown people and say, this must be a group of Black and brown people. There's no way to identify brains in that way.
I just laugh because I know. I mean, it's not funny, but it's a little. It's just like the history of when you think about eugenics, it's just so nuts.
It's
right?
crazy. It's crazy, right? But this is exactly what you're talking about. That mass incarceration could take a different form, right? And so there's this thing bubbling up now,
sure.
And you've got scientists saying, the brains are impacted in it.
Yeah.
So, so she gave a solid set of here's what you say. That it first of all that it's just not accurate. That's not the right way to interpret the data. But also here's what to do and say, and then to walk into the hackathon where these young people's brains are at full display and they're really working in creative ways, and some are sprawled out on the floor, and some are kind of and they have the freedom to express themselves in the ways in which they want, even as they are creating and building and learning. That to me was a very, very powerful moment.
So I think one of the big moments for me actually was watching. So I introduced Sonia Childress of Firelight Media yesterday for her session, and she played a teaser. And I didn't go to HBCU, a historically Black college, but tons of my friends and sisters have, sisters and brothers. And she played a teaser of this movie that's coming up, and I was really choked up by the teaser. Because what she explained and what the movie sort of it was raw footage, was explaining was, that this is not only looking back at the history of the African American community, right, in the United States, but it's a history of democracy, right? And so that when we understand how these institutions came about and how they were built, that we really begin to peel back the onion of how this democratic process works. And so there was something super special to me, one, about seeing these amazing images, right? They have footage from like the 1920s.
Oh my gosh.
It's really beautiful. And so I think there's something really beautiful, right, about seeing these images, a husband and wife that have been married 68 years, that met, on his first day on campus. And like, what is there's a voice in the movie that says, here there were these people in this safe space, right? Like you're saying in the hackathon, living their best lives on these campuses, and then yet they stepped out into Jim Crow. And so what does that do to your spirit and your soul? And I think to some extent, lots of people are still living that reality, right? I mean, I always say, as a woman of color, as a Latina, I was told by James Bell said that, everybody knows I'm Puerto Rican when I open my mouth because of the accent. And I was like, I wear that very proudly on my sleeve. But like, what does it mean, right? To sort of be in this body at this moment in time, in a position where I get to do this great work. And yet, right, there are these moments of microaggression sort of everywhere. Yeah. And so I think that for me, those are really powerful moments, right? That we create these safe spaces because we have to, because it's the way you move things forward. And yet there is this reality, right? Especially with the current election season, we see it, And so there was something to me very powerful about that clip. And then watching the Panthers movie yesterday, I had seen parts of it, to see like there are these moments in time, and I think we're in one right now. These windows where like it bubbles up, right? It bubbles up, and so then how do we learn from the past that there were these they're fragile though, right? Transitions are fragile. In yoga, they say that too, right? Transitions are fragile. You have to pay attention to those moments of transition. And so how do we pay attention to not repeat, right? The mistakes, the learning, how do we learn? And so there's that movie, the Black Panther, the Vanguard movie, is filled with all these moments of what we say in Spanish, gotitas de aprendizaje, right? These little like pearls of wisdom. And I think that to me was really powerful, to sit there and say, well, how do I learn, from these moments as well? So for me, those were, two lessons.
Yeah.